Hey, deserving listeners, this is part 2 in which I watch the curious case of Natalia Grace. Let's watch.
It was really the third or fourth therapist we got to that seemed to understand what we're telling them and seemed to have Natalia's number.
Having Natalia's number, that's worrisome because that could indicate some kind of anti-child bias on behalf of the therapist. I don't know that, but, and also he could just be framing it that way. Like, I would have parents who would say that about my work with the child. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, Kirk really has his number," and I'd be like, "No, don't phrase it like that." I'm not against the child, but some parents really, after a lot of issues and their own childhood issues, of which we don't even know for Michael, I doubt they'll go into it, and Christine about their own childhood issues. Who knows?
She pulled Christine and I aside and said, "You're all in extreme danger." At that point in time, we already knew that. We had been living that. So we were not stunned at the danger.
Okay, I don't know. Maybe they'll go into the exact assessment. Maybe they'll even interview the therapist. Somehow I doubt that. But extreme danger, yeah. Even if I barely understood the situation, there's enough information to be very concerned. Out of a concern for the family's safety, you would want to, as a therapist, really highlight the risks. Now, for myself, if I thought that there was, say, a 3% chance that Natalia was going to try to kill them in the middle of the night with a knife, that would be enough for me to say what he is saying, what the therapist said, that you guys are in danger. You need to take action to protect yourself. So to say, "Oh my God, you're in danger," that doesn't mean that a therapist necessarily believes you're in imminent danger and she definitely is going to kill you unless you do something to stop her. It could just mean, look, there's enough data here to raise the remote possibility, but we don't want to roll dice when it comes to someone in your family dying, right? Now, it's also possible that the therapist was genuinely thinking that the family was in imminent danger and either had viable reasons to make that assessment or not, but it's possible that the therapist was genuinely severely concerned.
But we're stunned at the diagnosis. We were expecting a severe mental disorder that was out of her control. We were expecting schizophrenia.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, I wasn't proposing those constructs and labels because there weren't any other symptoms provided or any other accounts provided that pointed in any of those directions. Without those, you start to hypothesize about any social conduct disorder or psychopathy. I'm guessing that's where he's headed.
We were expecting something. We were expecting her to say she hears voices. She's hearing commands tell her to do this stuff. So she tells us she's a sociopath.
Okay, so sociopath is not a diagnosis. Do therapists and clinicians still use that term? Yeah, but it's rare. And in my world and in my cultural pocket, with the individuals that do forensic psychology and diagnosing in a rigorous way in psychology, we don't use the word sociopath because it's not formally defined. I've done a whole series of episodes, but one particular episode I broke that you can actually search on my YouTube channel about psychopathy versus antisocial versus sociopathy, and I go over the literature because it's all consensus. When you talk about what is an apple versus what is an orange, these are scientific facts. You have probably DNA involved that you can look at to identify that's an apple, that's an orange, or the morphology of the two fruit are very different. When we're talking about what's the difference between someone with psychopathy, or does someone suffer from psychopathy or sociopathy, or what's the definition of sociopathy versus psychopathy or antisocial, we're talking about a bunch of humans that over the span of 150 years are writing in research journals or in their own publications, books, whatnot, or speaking at conferences, and the people are from all over the world, and everyone is basically free to define these things in the way that they want. Now, with antisocial personality disorder, that has been formalized in terms of criteria from the work of the American Psychiatric Association and the publishing of the various DSMs, the diagnostic. The diagnostic manuals that we use. Psychopathy and sociopathy are not in here. Psychopathy has been thrown around for a long time, and most people use the Hare definition and criteria. There was a psychologist, I believe he's a psychologist, named Hare, Hare. I forget his first name, but I have a book of his behind me. And it lays out what most would call a subset of people with antisocial that is particularly a con artist and frequently conning people and frequently committing crimes. Now, sociopathy is sometimes just considered another word for a psychopath, sometimes considered just another word for antisocial. Sometimes it's defined as someone who is socialized to act psychopathic, but doesn't have the pervasive foundational personality traits of a psychopath, so they can unlearn their behavior. Like if someone grew up in a war-torn country or a part of the city that had a lot of violence, then they might adopt a sociopathic personality to survive, or it's what's been modeled to them, or in their families they had to adopt that perspective of lack of empathy, but foundationally they have, so there's various different definitions. And you'll hear people on the internet, YouTube included, just making shit up about the definitions. I'm going to take a guess, particularly on TikTok, and say that 99% of the videos, in particular, of people talking about the differences between psychopathy and sociopathy and antisocial are talking out of their ass. It's also kind of a hacky thing to say for a clinician to use the word, because we have other words that are more precise. All that is to say that we heard from Michael, his account, we don't know the reality, that this therapist that seemed to have Natalia's number identified her as being a sociopath or suffering from sociopathic personality disorder or something. And that indicates someone that lacks empathy, someone that doesn't care about other people's feelings. Now, there's a lot of constructs that are associated with we'll just say psychopathy or antisocial that aren't necessarily associated. They're correlated, but they're not the same thing. People will throw a lot of things into this basket. Things like Machiavellianism, which is the trait or the tendency to plan ahead to screw people over. It's one thing to react to someone who's like, screw you, right? Like if your brother takes your toy and if you're a psychopathic child or a person, then you just smack your brother as hard as you can and you take the toy back. No remorse, total disregard for other people's feelings. That is one thing. That's an impulse and a lack of empathy. It's a whole other thing to plan ahead and say, I am going to smack my brother tomorrow, and here's how I'm going to do it. And they're making claims along those lines that she would drop the kids' favorite toys on the road so that the kids would run out and be killed. That kind of allegation is pretty unusual. It's possible, especially given the story they're telling us. But that one, I would need a lot of corroboration and a lot of evidence to demonstrate that that was a viable interpretation. There's also the construct of sadism, which is different from psychopathy as well, in that sadists people suffering from what we might call sadistic personality disorder, have a desire. They gain a lot of pleasure from harming others, or at the very least witnessing other people being harmed, whether it's them being lied to or pushed down or killed. And people suffering from this disorder are very concerning, obviously. And sadism is associated with psychopathy or antisocial or a lack of empathy, but they're not always together in the same person. You can actually have sadism and foundationally get a lot of desire from seeing other people be harmed or like to harm others in some severe ways. At the same time, you do have empathy for other people. And so I've treated people like this, and I've heard from people like this, and they know not to harm others, but sometimes they can't resist the urge, but they have remorse about it and they regret it. So being a sadist isn't necessarily being a psychopath, and being a psychopath isn't necessarily being a sadist. Now, both, then you have some very difficult people, if you will, people who don't care about your feelings and actually want to harm you. Then that's and have Machiavellianism and plan ahead in advance. Yeah, because when you plan ahead in advance, you can get away with it. Whereas if you're impulsive, which is a classic psychopathic thing, then you get in trouble and you get put in jail, which is what happens a lot to these people. And then the other trait is narcissism. And by the way, I'm talking about the dark tetrad. I've made episodes about this as well. Sometimes we say dark triad because we don't include sadism in there, but with narcissism, being very self-centered, being grandiose about yourself, your abilities, your achievements, this sort of thing, is narcissism in a nutshell. And we're not talking about narcissistic personality disorder, we're just talking about a trait. So for people that are psychopathic, meaning they lack empathy and remorse or concern for other people, if they also are sadistic, if they also are Machiavellian, if they also are narcissistic, then we have the dark tetrad, and we have particularly if they're moderate to severe in each of these traits, then we have a very, very concerning individual. Whereas if you just have one of them, then it's less of a concern. Not that those individuals can't harm people, but I say all this because in the public discourse, and really even among clinicians, they will lump all of these constructs into psychopath or into someone with antisocial. So I say all this because you can have an individual, let's say that with a lot of assessment, we would find that Natalia does in fact lack empathy and remorse and concern for other people's feelings, just fundamentally. Not that she's blocked off from her empathy, because that's another thing to think about, as I often will talk about, is someone with narcissistic personality disorder, so now we're talking about a whole other area, they will have impaired empathy, but they have empathy, they have the capacity for empathy, but they're so concerned, they're so worried about losing the race of being the best at everything, because when they were young, that was a very dangerous situation for them, or at least a very scary situation, a very lonely situation, that they are eclipsed from their own empathy. We all do this. If the sort of classic example is you are helping your daughter to learn how to ride her bike, and she's a lovely person. She has empathy like a regular kid. She's 8 years old, and you're helping her with the bike, and you have your hand on the bike so she doesn't fall over, and you're like, oh, you're doing good. And she says, let go. I think I can do it on my own. And you think, you sure? He's like, yeah, let go. I can do it on my own, Dad. Don't let me. And then you let go, and she goes forward about a half block, and she crashes and she hurts herself and she skins her knee, and you run up to her and you say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? And your daughter screams at you and says, how dare you? I hate you, Dad. Why did you let go? Okay. So in that moment, if you just take it as at face value, you see a child that is psychopathic. It's a weird word to put to it, but they have disregard for other people's feelings. They're self-centered. They're not looking at the situation rationally. But we all understand that because the child is in a very difficult situation. They're in pain. They might be ashamed of themselves. They might be demoralized. It's overwhelming. And so when we are overwhelmed, we are potentially eclipsed from our own empathy, our own concern for other people's feelings. Well, that's the same for people with narcissistic personality and moderate to severe narcissistic personality. They've been eclipsed since day one. So their empathy is primordial to begin with. So even when they do have access to it, it's not very refined or mature, but they do have the capacity for it. Whereas people with psychopathy, seemingly, at least as the way we conceptualize them, they just fundamentally don't have it for whatever reason, developmentally or abuse-wise, or they were born that way. They seem to lack that. I say all this because if you had someone in your life that lacked empathy, and it was determined that it was true, psychopathy or antisocial type of lack of empathy, then you would potentially be assuming too much by looking to culture and associating that person with Machiavellianism, sadism, and narcissism. They might actually just lack empathy for other people. They might have those other things. They're highly correlated, but they're not necessarily together in one person. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's a new year, so of course it's time for New Year's resolutions. But often, those are just manifestations of internalized harmful voices that tell us we're not good enough. So instead of making a resolution to change something, let's recognize that we are already good enough. Now, most people think of therapy as a place for us to work on our problems, But there are several schools of thought within the field of psychotherapy that adamantly reject that paradigm, like narrative therapy and solution-focused. Instead, these clinicians help us focus on what we're already doing well. And by helping us do that, data shows that we often will gravitate towards more beneficial patterns. Well, one place you can find such therapists is on BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, it's definitely worth giving a try. So celebrate the progress you've already made. Visit betterhelp.com/Kirk today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Kirk.
She knows what she's doing. She's in control of doing it. It's not a diagnosis where she's out of control and she can really be helped. She's a sociopath. That was the first moment from a clinician that we heard, you can't help here.
You're 12 years old and you're, just down the hallway is someone who's living with.
Yeah, so Jacob and the other kids would be particularly traumatized because they have no power because they're children. But getting back to what Michael was saying is that the therapist saying, that ship has sailed. There's nothing you can do. The child has this condition. You're just going to have to learn to live with it. There's no amount of therapy to change that aspect. You can actually work with people who have psychopathy and lack empathy. There is a road to helping them to function better in society. Also, no respectable clinician would diagnose confidently a young person with sociopathy or psychopathy or antisocial. You just can't know for sure. Now, maybe the therapist did have a lot of time, so who knows. But yeah, I have had that conversation, whether it's about psychopathy in a child or a family member, an adult, or it's some other issue, like a frequent conversation I would have with parents of adopted kids. Now, I want to be clear that plenty of adopted kids develop fine, even kids that are adopted post 6 months of age. So I don't want to paint that generalization, but I did treat a lot of families that had adopted kids that were adopted post 6 months, whether it was 12 months or 24 months or even at the age of 5. They had been through a lot of trauma and a lot of attachment injury, and then they're adopted. So I would treat these families. I had a small specialization. I would say 5% of my clients in my first, 7 years as a therapist were these kinds of families. And what I would sometimes find myself telling the parents was something along these lines. Not that the child is a psychopath. Maybe the kid is, but I wouldn't necessarily know yet until the child develops and ages a little bit. But I would be having this conversation of, it looks like your child early in life, due to the circumstances regarding their attachment and their parenting and caregiving from the age of 0 to 3 or whatever, it seems that there's a neurological difference or a personality or developmental difference, whatever word we want to say to this. There's a difference about this child that results in the kind of behavior that you're seeing today. This isn't ADHD. This isn't bipolar. This isn't depression. This isn't anxiety. We're not going to treat this with medication and psychotherapy. This is something about the child that is probably going to be with them forever. And that's a hard pill to swallow because it's very dire, right? It's seemingly hopeless. It's not hopeless, though, is the thing. There are things that you can do. And the sooner the family could recognize this, the sooner we could get to the things that actually might be able to, quote unquote, help. It's not going to take away the problem, but it's going to account for it. And the parents who did eventually get there, then I was able to start working with them on those other things. But prior to them accepting that, they still have this idea that society has given them, and a lot of people in my field have given people, that therapy can help, and that there's medications, and there's diets, and there's other kinds of programs that will actually turn people around. People on Facebook saying, I did this program and now my kid's great. Or I did a boot camp or whatever. Now my kid's great. And there's not a lot of information out there. It's sort of like what I imagine a lot of medical professionals run into when you have someone that is diagnosed with some sort of chronic condition, like migraine, for example, that, well, isn't there a medication to fix these problems, or isn't there some sort of surgery or back pain, for example? There's a lot of misinformation or just lack of awareness that, well, surely there's something, severe, I don't want surgery necessarily, but if nothing else works, surely there's a surgery, there's some kind of thing we can do here. And for some conditions, there isn't. And that's very distressing. And a lot of people will, in those situations, turn to pseudoscientific charlatans who will try to sell you something. That's, in fact, if you want to find out what the frontier of medical and psychological science, what the frontiers are, because where the frontiers are, we don't know enough yet to help people with these kinds of problems. If you want to know where the frontiers are, all you have to do is look at all the pseudoscientific charlatans online that are selling things, because there's not a lot of people selling snake oil regarding, I don't know, something like cavities, for example, tooth decay, because it's pretty well understood. It's not super complicated what's happening, right? There's enough research in our history and enough knowledge in society that I'm sure there are pseudoscientific charlatans regarding cavities, but I haven't seen any. Whereas there's a lot of charlatans regarding psychology, regarding ADHD, regarding autism spectrum, regarding certain kinds of cancer, regarding energy level, and sleep difficulties. It's everywhere. And so the reason for that is because it's hard to accept that there's nothing science can do for you, especially with what you're asking for. You're asking to fix this child, and we're not going to do that. We're going to do things that might account for things and reduce the harm to everyone, particularly your other kids. But this is here to stay. This is probably an issue that this child and everyone around this person is going to have to deal with for the rest of this person's life. That's a very difficult thing to accept. And I get it. And getting a second opinion would be, of course, important. But it's hard. And so I would have these conversations with parents, and it would be very hard. This is a thing that happens sometimes, and there's only so much you can do. And there are definitely some things that are not likely to work. Trying to inject empathy or connect with the child in the way that you can connect with it. Because that's the other thing. It's not just this lack of empathy thing. There's often this lack of connection that's even possible with people in this category, because they, due to this early neglect in life, they not only have lack of empathy, but they just don't really see. The way that I would tell people, because I ran into this a lot, was that these individuals, when they're interacting with other humans, it's more instrumental. Like when I interact with humans, whether it's a cashier at the store or my wife, there's a feeling I get of concern or empathy, or I feel myself inside of somebody else. Like I can feel their emotions. I don't know if I know their emotions, but there's a concern. Also, when I'm interacting with them, I'm highly focused on them, because for most humans, we're very focused on other humans. We're very, what's going on with that human? And I'm very concerned with what they're thinking, even the cashier at the store. And as I say this, you might think, well, I don't know how concerned I am about the cashier or some random stranger. However concerned you are with other random humans, strangers, for people with this kind of background where they've been neglected and those neurons have not been developed, where they had a lot of interaction with other humans from 0 to 2, they don't have that innate foundational concern, not only just for feelings, but just for the whole idea of other humans. And so the other humans might as well just be like a computer or a car or money. It's only just a means to an end. Because for humans that have developed at least somewhat well, or at least okay, our needs are met often through other humans. And we don't consider humans necessarily to be just instruments to get what we want. We actually consider the humans to be what we want, right? Whereas for these individuals, since they didn't have those interactions that would lock in that association, there's a critical window that is hypothesized that needs to be capitalized on to provide those neuronal connections of associating other humans with emotion and needs and attachment. If they don't have that, then other humans are just, they're just dust in the wind. And if the individual needs something that involves other humans, then they'll concern themselves with humans. But as soon as that's over, it's over. It can be very, very hard for people. Now, I don't know what's happening in this story, so let's keep watching.
With you who actively wants to harm you, that's a very scary feeling. And I definitely didn't feel safe around Natalia. I just was scared.
Yeah, that's something that hasn't been highlighted yet, that the individuals and the kids in the home, him being a kid back then, the amount of fear, but the parents too, for myself, in the times that I have had to work clinically with people that exhibit this kind of behavior, and I can never know what's really happening, but when I've been around people like this, in my capacity, however limited it is, because I'm only with them, say, an hour or two a week, it can be terrifying because so much of our safety, our sense of safety, is dependent on this assumption that other people at least think somewhat the way that we do. And when you have enough knowledge to know that they don't think in fundamental ways the way we do, then all bets are off. God knows what they're going to do, especially if you have someone saying they're going to kill you and they're trying to kill you. They're hoarding weapons to kill you. But I do want to honor that, how terrifying it would be. Like I said, my capacity, I would be with them 1 or 2 hours a week. And for some of them, it would be very, very scary. I wouldn't be able to sleep well at night, potentially. I would have these flash images of them coming to my house and killing me, even though there was no evidence that they would do that. It's really terrifying. I imagine horror movies and other kinds of TV shows don't help with this, but I think it's also kind of rational, and especially when you have someone that is actively threatening with knives. So yeah, it's a special kind of trauma, this fear, because it's one thing to have someone, like you're in a bank and some people rob the bank and they hold you at gunpoint. That can be very traumatic. But it's a different kind of trauma when it's every day and your home where that fear is present. It might not be spikes of anxiety, or there might be occasional, but it's just this low-grade terror that is happening at all times. Yeah, for him, being in that house, and for the whole family, and I've been with families like this, I really, it's hard to think of a lot of things that are worse than that. Just that feeling of, at any point in time, in my safe place of home, where my food is and my bathroom is and my soda and my family and my things, at any point there's this person who could just pop up out of the shadows and kill me or someone else or do something to me or my things. It's very, very dysregulating, and I feel terrible for everybody if this is true. But he doesn't have any reason to lie. Now, I guess there's a chance that he's been lied to and he was made to feel this way because of lies. But regardless, even if he was lied to, it's still a terrifying, you just feel bad for him. All right, well, let's adjourn there. I will pick up in the next episode where I left off. So tune in next time. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, truly, because you deserve it. You really, really do.